Sorry, I was interrupting all of you, and I'm not even sure why, because I don't have that many questions to ask.
The only person you actually need to apologize to is the first speaker.
Do you want to add to what you said?
You got that.
The rest of us were prepared.
Do you want to add to what you said, sir?
I have questions to ask, but you are the moderator. You may take over.
We will come back to those questions. But what I understood from all three remarks was that separation of powers is basically a means to an end. That's not the problem. The issue is democracy or democratic deficit, really. And the issue is about decentralization of political power. And how do we get around doing that? And Rahul is sitting here, Rahul and Aditi, and they've actually put much more thought into the subject than I have. And they'd come for a discussion. And one of the questions that Rahul was posing was, how would Montesquieu have thought about the Indian experience? Had he encountered the Indian experience, what kind of theory would he have come up with? How, for instance, would he have thought about coalition politics in parliament? How does separation of powers unfold in such a situation? So I want to open with that, the problem of democracy. How do you view coalition politics? How do you view proportional representation rather than first past the post? And third of all, the argument that Parliament doesn't really represent the will of the people. Elections are not enough of a check on parliamentary legitimacy. Every decision-making, every site of decision-making should be contested in its own right, on its own merits. So what do you feel about contestations on the street, protests, people's tribunals, citizen action and such?
Can you just break this up into specific questions that we can sort of answer?
Yeah.
First of all, can I just say one thing, if you don't mind? Yeah. Don't use Montesquieu as a reference point. I'll tell you why. Because he was a creature of his times. Right?
Absolutely,
Say,
yes.
How would he view a coalition? He would not even be able to envisage it. So,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
I think
yes.
he was basically a liberty champion because of the oppression of the Bourbon dynasty in France. So I would leave Montesquieu.
That's fair.
He's not
That's
relevant
fair.
to us at all.
How do we view then the process of the political process of decentralization?
By order, which, no, I do not disagree with what my far more learned and esteemed panelists have said. But I'm troubled by a question. Do we judge the need or the importance of a principle which is inseparable from democracy by asking ourselves whether individually the three entities which need to have checks and balances are democratic or not? Or do we uphold the principle as supreme in itself? Yes, families can be undemocratic, but there are laws by which some attempt at gender parity is being attempted. Should we give up that effort? Yes, and you yourself, Justice Muralidhar, cited the issue of the Keshavan and Bharti case, where at some point the judiciary put its foot down. Now, it doesn't mean that the judiciary in itself, in its own working, is entirely democratic. But it upheld a principle of democracy which is essential for the functioning of a democracy. I mean, you cited the appointment of judges. We all know that I think there is no other country in the world where judges appoint judges. We adopted that principle, perhaps for valid reasons, because we had an excess of executive interference in ensuring pliable judges in the past. But let me disillusion the judiciary that it has those powers of appointing itself, because it can make a recommendation, and from the government, that recommendation has no time limit for response. And some of those who have been recommended actually retire or give up the desire to become a judge. The government can veto that independence by sheer inaction, which is not happenstance. So, what essential point I'm trying to make is that the ethicality of each of the separate institutions we can have a separate debate upon. Since I have saddled the world of both the bureaucracy, in a sense the executive, and in politics, I can give two separate minor lectures under the Justice Ajay Tripathi Foundation for it. But that is not the issue here. The issue here, again, and that's a valid question, right? Are we a functioning parliamentary democracy or are we not? And if we claim to be, then are checks and balances important or not? And if they are some definitions of separation of powers to be pursued or not? Or do we give up the effort? That is the fundamental question I want to raise. And I'm afraid my answer to it is that for everything else that you have said about how democratic we are. For instance, I'll give you an example. Pardon me, now I'm just taking my revenge by taking a little more time. All of us speak of corruption in high places. But if we ask ourselves, and I wrote about this in my book Being Indian, and I've discussed our notion of individual morality. If you are challaned, and if you can pass on a couple of $100 to the policeman, you will do it. And in the evening, in the drawing rooms, talk about the damnation of the country because of corruption in high places. But does that mean that we do not put CCTV cameras to monitor speed on some roads, which is the only way to actually independently use technology to enforce laws? So all I'm trying to say is that the goal cannot be given up, and which has to be the separation of powers, not in the French sense, and Mahesh has himself said, we no longer discuss it today, but checks and balances, checks and balances. If the judiciary becomes an extended colluder of a majoritarian executive in parliament and a pliant bureaucracy, then we are not a democracy. Simply put, if the media, and the fourth pillar, incidentally, we are not talking about, the freedom of the media. If the media is compromised, and it has been a threat now and it has been a threat in the past, because media is owned by corporate leaders. Corporate leaders have businesses in addition to merely running a newspaper or a channel. And they are very susceptible to government pressure. Apurvanandji is here, he will vouch for the fact that, the media is completely compromised.
Yes.
Very often. And so who's going to ask the question? With due apologies to my good friend Mahesh, because I admire him so much that I never voice any differences politically. But we have a chief executive who hasn't answered a question anyway in an open press conference. That, of course, is his personal choice. He speaks very well otherwise. But the point I'm making is that that if these checks and balances goes, even though we may be undemocratic or corrupt in our individual lives, what is the system that allows it to remain a democracy? This is the question I want to ask.
So what are those checks and balances? How do you make the citizenry less corrupt? Does citizen action help?
Yes, of course, a vigilant citizenry is, in my view, the best check to all excesses in all three branches. But very often, even they are intimidated. I mean, look at the kind of acts we have under which people can be picked up and put into jail without the option of bail for years. And I'm sorry, sir, you have been part of that system. Cases penned for years.
I'm equally sorry. In the Chief Justice.
I know. What I'm saying is that a master of the roster, justice delayed is justice denied. I raise a voice and I am picked up for a PMLA act. Very often, very necessary, because there are people who need to be punished. But the process is the punishment. By the time I am proved innocence, a lifetime can go by. I mean, I gave the example, sir, of the electoral bonds. 8 years you don't hear it, and then you reverse it. Who will compensate for what has happened in the 8 years that have passed? There has to be rethinking within each institution.
Justice Muralidhar, the problem of democracy and on-site contestations. And
No, I don't think, I don't think I even suggested that we do away with checks and balances or separation of powers. I was pointing out to the weaknesses in how the institutions are functioning. And if we don't address those inherent weaknesses, then we can't expect it to work. I think we are still a work in progress.
Quite.
Yes, and we are still learning, we are still evolving. So I think to answer your first question about first past the post, which is why we need a strong election commission, right? So you should see where we need to address, at what levels we need to address. It's like, you inspect a whole building. A good structural engineer will tell you what points in the foundations are weak, where we need to pay attention to, and if you don't address those cracks and those, fissures, then there's a danger of the edifice falling. We all want that edifice to remain. I mean, I should not be misunderstood as saying, no, I don't believe in that edifice, we should do away with all of this. Not at all. I think it's important for us to talk about it, important for us to introspect, to know where we are and why we are where we are. Like I look at the 3 recent developments in our neighborhood, all right? And they're hope-giving. Sri Lanka, when I look at, I say, okay, people's power asserted when they actually stormed Rajapaksa's presidential palace. We know all those images before us, followed by a problematic election, and now another election with a very surprising result. And it gives people hope that people's power is back. You look at Bangladesh, you would think that was also a kind of revolution, but it's not working out the same way, and it is causing concern. I look at US, and I look at the person who nominated chosen for being the Attorney General. And you know that then again the same thing, concentration of power. If in the US we had this debate on separation of powers, they'll say it with Trump there, and with Republican control of the Senate and the House. And it's a Supreme Court of 6-3. What separation of power are we talking about? But I'll agree with Pavanji that they are expected, having got into those positions, they're expected to function in a certain way. And I think public debate, public discussion is what will remind them that you may have come through a certain process, but having come here, there are certain expectations that we as people have of you wielding that power. And don't betray that expectation. I think that is a message that should go out to all of these people. The message can go out through a media. But if, again, like Pavanji says, it's a corporate controlled media, then you have a problem. So you have to address it at various fronts.
So there's the normative, and then there's the
Yeah, so the Constitution tells you what is expected of people in power. And it's a constant interrogation, a constant revisiting, and that's why there's a churning. I would say we're still in the midst of a huge churning. It's too early to give up hope at all. In fact, I'm suggesting to the contrary. It's too early to give up hope. It's important to keep discussing. I'm glad that amidst all this control of the media, There are some influencers who have their YouTube channels, who people watch and listen to. And there is this alternate media that's emerging. And I've said elsewhere also, the human spirit is so strong and resilient that it will assert itself despite the despots and the dictators.
And Mr. Jethmalani, sir, the problem of democracy, the street as a site of contestation, and otherwise structural things like proportional representation.
Look, there's no gainsaying the fact that free and fair elections are the heartbeat of a democracy. It's a necessary condition for democracy, right? Of course, it's not a sufficient condition. So let's identify what you consider to be the sufficient conditions and where these sufficient conditions are deficient. And then we go, that's how I would take up the discussion. And then, how do you reform the wrong that's taking place in those institutions hitherto vested with power by the Constitution itself to be a check and balance, right? So that's the way I would look at it. And ultimately, let's remember one thing, right? Eternal vigilance, the cliche goes, is the price of liberty. It is the citizen's responsibility. You cannot throw your hands up in the air and say our institutions are failing and moan and groan, right? There's a government. It's been elected. Nobody's challenged the election. Some people may moan about the electoral system, the EVMs, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is they're freely and fairly elected, right? All right. Now they come with an agenda to Parliament. Right? Being in Parliament for just 3.5 years, I find how useless I am, right? Because the best work I've done is in parliamentary committees, where I've participated in scrapping obsolete laws. So we swept out about 500 laws off the statute book. I mean, they were all useless laws. There were, the railway magistrates' courts were fully clogged up with cases, with millions of cases of ticketless travel.
Yes.
So we just said, make this punishable with an instant fine and finish it. Now the railway, the clog is moved. So you have to have innovative people in Parliament who do this in committees, right? If you think that Parliament is a great lawmaking body, right? I hate to devalue the institution because I was a part of it and I hope I will be a part of it in the future. But the fact of the matter is, what are citizens doing about this duty gap? In Parliament, everybody gets up, they make their speeches, they talk on bills. Unfortunately, the real check, should be the real check on government excesses, including bad laws, is the opposition. Because unless I give up my seat, right? If I find what I do is if I find a provision wrong, I go and mention it in private. If I say something is wrong, right? Or I go on a symposium, or I have a memorial lecture, my father's name, and I say what is wrong. That's how I do it. That's my own contribution. But in Parliament, were I dare to challenge a bill, and I'm a subject to a whip, I'll be disqualified, right? So should then the 10th schedule go? I think there's a strong case for the 10th schedule going. Yes? It destroys,
Sorry to interrupt. Actually, it is remarkable for people who want to read the judgment. Mahesh's father strongly argued against the whip.
He's right.
He said the whip is an anathema to democracy. If a dissenter within a political party wants to express opposition to the party's decision, he should permit it to. But of course, he was...
he was a single minority on two issues. One was on the NJAC. In Parliament, he was the only member who said, yes, we should continue the collegiate system. In Parliament, in both houses. And then he was the sole dissenter on what you just mentioned.
The problem is the dissent within a political party, and I've been part of, 1.5 or 2. The point is that dissent within the party should certainly be allowed. But when that dissent translates to voting against the bill brought by Parliament, there is now the fear that in especially very wobbly coalition governments, money has been paid.
That should be the sole test for disqualification. You're right.
Money has been paid.
Can you establish the payment of quid pro quo for a vote or a speech.
Yes.
Yes.
But that's not an easy thing to establish.
It's
I mean,
not
that's
easy to establish.
speculative.
But look at the alternative. Has the 10th schedule, Shahrukh,
Yes.
right? Has the 10th schedule stopped defections? No. That
It
was the
had-
purpose, right?
Yeah.
You still have,
Fair point.
I mean, you have, in fact, you have more stable governments now than ever before. It was supposed to stop coalition governments and government instability and
Right.
defections.
Yes.
So I see no purpose today of the 10th. And there are so many cases pertaining to the 10th schedule which clog up the Supreme Court for days on end, which are unnecessary, if you ask me.
And also the dissenter, even if he doesn't vote, knows that his political future in that party is finished. So as your very respected father had to deal with, many people with a conscience. I was expelled from the party to which I belong because of my dissent against not the CAA, but the CAA hyphenated with the NRC. And if I was, and I was very close to him. The point I'm making is it comes with its own, well, if you look at it like that, its own punishments. Or if you look at it differently, its own rewards. But it's difficult for most people to pursue principle over short-term gain.
We now learn how legislators lose their freedom of speech.